It's August 21st, 1791, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.
Voodoo ceremonies can involve singing and dancing and sometimes animal sacrifice. But today in history, in 1791, the animal that ended up dead was human, or more to the point, many thousands of humans, because this particular voodoo ceremony at Bois Caïman in modern-day Haiti was the start of a slave rebellion that kicked off the Haitian Revolution.
Yes, it was led by the Jamaican voodoo priest, Dutty Boukman. He called on the spirits of ancestral Africa to avenge the French. Rallying the crowd, he said, "Let's throw away the image of the god of the whites who thirsts for our tears. Listen to the liberty that speaks in all our hearts." So, as you say, modern-day Haiti, then a French Caribbean colony, Saint-Domingue. 40% of the sugar and half the coffee consumed in the world, plus loads of cotton and chocolate and textile dyes, came out of Saint-Domingue.
Yeah, the name Haiti actually comes from the name that was given to the island by the native Taino people, who were very quickly almost wiped out by colonists through forced labor, violence, disease. So the colonists very quickly turned to the African slave trade to work these huge coffee and sugar plantations. And slavery, obviously we know from a lot of media that covers slavery is set in the United States, and we all obviously know how brutal that system was. But if anything, if possible, slavery was even more unfathomably brutal on Saint-Domingue. Yellow fever was a huge part of it. It contributed to a death rate of about 50% of people per year. So there was this constant influx of new arrivals to make up for the ones who had died. And because the life expectancy was so short, it was seen as being pointless to try and reform the system, to try and improve conditions, because they were like, well, everyone's going to die anyway. They didn't think of the enslaved people as human, because they thought of them as sort of cattle who had an extremely high turnover rate. In this system as well, whites were even more outnumbered than they were in parts of the American South. They were outnumbered 10-1. And so they were terrified of uprisings, justifiably, because of the brutality of the repression that they were inflicting on the people. The atmosphere was on a knife edge, but the profits were so huge that they felt like, they couldn't stop because it was contributing so much money to France's coffers. And Dutty was a product of this sort of Caribbean plantation system. He was born in Africa in an area that's now Senegal and Gambia, apparently raised as a Muslim and considered a bit of a scholar, which is the source of his name, Boukman. He was initially enslaved and transported to Jamaica, which is probably why his nickname was English, before being sold on to Saint-Domingue. And at some point in his enslavement, he had embraced voodoo, and by now he was a voodoo priest.
Yeah, and so on the night in question, he got together with representatives from nearby plantations who all secretly gathered in the woods near Le Cap, and they had this ceremony. A witness said that around 200 enslaved Africans attended. There are no known first-hand written accounts about what took place on the night, but this excerpt from the official History of Haiti and the Haitian Revolution gives a good sense of what went on. It said it was raining and the sky was raging with clouds. The slaves then started confessing their resentment of their conditions. A woman danced languorously in the crowd, taken by the spirit of the Loas, and with a knife in her hand, she cut the throat of a pig and distributed the blood to all the participants of the meeting, who swore to kill all the whites on the island.
Yeah, I mean, on the question of voodoo ceremonies specifically, they were reported very salaciously in Western Europe after this, and actually created the modern concept of the zombie, as we've discussed before, which is still with us. But I think it is important to reflect on the context, which is that religion, the voodoo religion, only came to wider attention when it was advantageous to depict the islanders as savages with no morality who needed civilized Europeans to control them because they just had an uprising. I mean, in fact, it's just a religion that's as bloody weird as any other, right? I mean, yes. Meeting at night and drinking blood is something that Catholics do too, just symbolically.
Yeah, and actually, according to accounts published later, during the ceremony, Dutty prophesied that the uprising would be led by Jean-François Papillon, Georges Bissou, and Jeanne Boulier. This has led skeptics to suggest that the ceremony never actually happened and that it was kind of reverse-engineered to give an aura of sanction and unity to the leadership who did emerge. And actually, just worth noting that some of those people, in fact, a lot of those people who were at the forefront of this revolution, Dutty himself, the voodoo priestess who conducted the ceremony with him, Cécile Fatiman, and Toussaint Louverture, they were not enslaved people. They were either escaped slaves living as maroons, or they were sometimes mixed race free people of colour. One of the really important things about this is the timing. The French Revolution had just occurred, and this was a critical moment because the white planter class saw this as a chance to declare their independence from France. They were not interested in revolutionary ideals, and this would have made conditions for the enslaved people even more intolerable, if you can possibly imagine that, and given the planter class free rein to impose even more restrictions or even a return to slavery for the free people of colour on the island. And in fact, many of those participating in this uprising did not seek independence from France. They wanted a closer relationship with France. They thought that the white planter class were either preventing their liberation, and lots of them believed that the revolutionaries would have abolished slavery, or they at least thought that the more sympathetic government in France might grant them more rights now. So this very much wasn't about independence from France, even though that's what ultimately would end up happening.
Well, to be fair, it was confusing because the revolution was also not a quick process, right? That took 2 years. And then for news to reach Saint-Domingue from France would have itself taken months, right? And then you're hearing a version of what's been agreed. So you hear about something like the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And the obvious question there is, well, which men? Does that include the ones we've enslaved that aren't technically French? And you can see that there would be debate about that.
Yeah, and you also get this sense that the planters who were on Saint-Domingue got this idea that they had to look after themselves. You know, they'd really long feared the idea that an uprising were coming. They'd tried their best to arm and prepare themselves for such a thing, but within weeks of this rebellion kicking off, it had swelled to 100,000 slaves in the north of the country, and over the next 2 months, as the violence continued to intensify, the insurgents killed 4,000 whites and destroyed 180 of the sugar plantations, along with hundreds of coffee and indigo plantations as well. And by September 1791, they'd obliterated 900 coffee plantations, causing an estimated 2 million francs worth of damage. So this was also a problem for France in terms of like the money that it had come to depend on from this very wealthy asset that it had. And the French Assembly eventually granted citizenship to all of the mixed race people on the island in April 1792. But the country was already torn apart so much by these rival factions, some of whom were also supporting the Spanish colonists in Santo Domingo, that it was very hard to kind of bring the island back together under any semblance of control.
Yeah, and when France offered the free black population in Saint-Domingue political and social rights, it shocked the world. People thought that they would brutally put down this uprising, but what they hoped to do was to form an alliance with influential free people of colour, lots of whom were the mixed race children of plantation owners, you know, and they had often some education or skills of some kind, you know, so they were hoping to use them to quell the worst of the violence. You know, white plantation owners and their families were tortured, killed, decapitated, you know, that had their heads displayed on pikes.
But it's still a tiny minority. I mean, it's not a surprise that once you actually do get everyone focused on the idea of overthrow, that's going to be easy to achieve when you are 90% of the population. You know, the white people in control were 5%. And then on top of all of that, you know, you've got the fact that they're essentially harvesting luxury products. You know, what's the purpose of their life? It's not corn. It's sugar and cotton and stuff to make France richer. You know, the French were thinking, what do we do about this? They had to do something because the alternative was, well, the British will get it or the Spanish will get it because they want the sugar.
Yeah, by now the most pressing concern was that Spain and Britain were both keen to use this chaos to take over what was the most profitable colony in the Caribbean. And so Biassou and Papillon, two of those leaders I mentioned earlier, they allied with the Spanish. You know, they saw this as a chance to use, you know, the enemy of my enemy as my friend and maybe get a better deal under a Spanish government. But when France's revolutionary government announced in 1794 that they would abolish slavery, Toussaint Louverture, who originally had joined the other generals in allying with the Spanish, agreed to work with them. You know, he was kind of a political moderate. He was a Catholic. He had been a supporter of the French royal family, while his rivals remained allied to the Spanish. And he was soon at the head of around 4,000 troops.
Yeah, Napoleon ended up basically dealing with him. He sent across his general Charles Leclerc with an experienced force, leading to several months of conflict with Toussaint. And Toussaint agreed to an armistice, but was subsequently imprisoned by the French and died in 1803. But a couple of his lieutenants, Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Henri Christophe, resumed the fight against the French, and the French forces were by now being weakened by a yellow fever epidemic. And less than 3 weeks weeks later, the French position in Haiti just became entirely untenable because of the renewal of hostilities between France and Britain. And basically that allowed Dessalines' army to defeat the French at the Battle of Vertières, and at this point he declared independence on January the 1st of 1804 under the name of Haiti.
The flag for Haiti was created, it's obvious when you see it, but it hadn't occurred to me before, by ripping the white band off the French tricolour. That's what the Haiti flag is.
Oh, that's good.
So again, you can imagine that moment of genuine liberation feeling of doing that. Must have been quite exciting.
Yeah, it was the largest recorded slave revolt since Spartacus, and it remains the only slave-led uprising in history which ended with freedom and self-rule for the formerly enslaved people. So it really is a completely unique event in history.
And the French definitely learnt their lesson and never colonized another place again.
And so another week of retrospecting ends. But next week begins a day early at Club Retrospectors. Join us now to get an exclusive episode every Sunday. Patreon.com/retrospectors.